The BC coast is also home to one of the most iconic, recognizable, and lovable aquatic mammals, the sea otter. Sea otters have actually endured a long, dark history in North America.
By the mid-20th century, the waters off the coast of British Columbia had gone silent. To the untrained eye, the ocean looked the same as it always had, cold, vast, and powerful. But beneath the surface, a catastrophe was unfolding. The towering underwater forests that had defined this coastline for millennia were gone. The fish had vanished. The nets of local fishermen came up empty. In their place was a suffocating carpet of spikes, millions of sea urchins gnawing the foundation of the ocean down to the bedrock. Scientists called these zones urchin barrens. It was a graveyard. The collapse hadn't happened by accident. It was the delayed echo of a slaughter that took place a century prior. The ecosystem was missing its architect. The ocean was dying, and marine biologists feared it was irreversible. But in 1969, a small team of Canadian scientists, led by marine ecologist Dr. Ian McCaskey, proposed a radical solution. It was dangerous, it was controversial, and it defied the economic interests of the entire coast. They didn't want to just protect the ocean. They wanted to rebuild it from the top down. To understand the solution, we have to understand the crime. For thousands of years, the Pacific Northwest was defined by kelp forests. These weren't just plants. They were underwater cathedrals, stretching 100 feet from the seafloor to the surface. They slowed the currents, prevented coastal erosion, and provided a nursery for salmon, herring, and rockfish. But kelp has a natural enemy, the sea urchin, a tireless grazer with no natural fear unless something is hunting it. In a balanced ocean, urchins hide in crevices, too terrified to leave the shadows. But when the keystone predator is removed, that fear vanishes, and the urchins emerge. 300,000. That's how many sea otters were slaughtered during the maritime fur trade of the 18th and 19th centuries. Their pelts, the densest fur of any mammal on Earth, fetched prices that rivaled gold. By 1929, the sea otter was functionally extinct along the British Columbia coast. There were no sentries left to guard the gates. Without the otter, the urchins exploded. They formed grazing fronts, moving like a slow-motion army, devouring the kelp holdfasts, the roots keeping the forest anchored. Once the holdfast is severed, the entire kelp plant floats away to rot. By the 1960s, vast stretches of the coastline had become underwater deserts. The ecological chain was shattered. The government faced a choice: watch the coast turn into a permanent dead zone, or attempt something that had never been done at this scale. They chose the latter. Dr. Ian McCaskey, a biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, championed a plan he called predator-led restoration. The concept sounds standard today, but in 1969 it was frontier science. The goal was audacious: reintroduce a keystone predator back into an ecosystem that had learned to exist without it for over a century. Between 1969 and 1972, Canadian officials launched a cross-border relocation mission. They sourced 89 sea otters from surviving colonies in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. The logistics were brutal. Otters are metabolic engines. They burn calories at an extraordinary rate and are incredibly fragile under stress. Even short transport times could be fatal. The otters were flown south in specialized wet crates designed to keep them cool and hydrated, then transferred to boats and released into the icy waters of Cheklisset Bay on the remote west coast of Vancouver Island. Dr. McCaskey and his team watched the animals disappear beneath the waves. There was no guarantee any of them would survive. This wasn't just about saving an endangered species. The otter was a living tool, an ecological countermeasure deployed to dismantle the urchin invasion from the top of the food chain. But almost immediately, the plan faced a revolt, and it wasn't coming from the ocean. Let's pause and remember what was at stake. The kelp forests were gone. The fish were gone. An entire marine ecosystem had collapsed, and the government had just released 89 hungry predators into waters that local industries depended on. Because while nature had been struggling, an economy had adapted. In the century the otters were gone, a massive shellfish industry had risen to harvest the very things otters eat: Dungeness crabs, butter clams, sea cucumbers, and yes, the sea urchins themselves, whose roe, known as uni, had become a delicacy worth millions in Japanese export markets. For commercial divers who had worked these waters for decades, the sea otter wasn't a hero. It was a competitor, and a relentless one. A single sea otter consumes roughly 25% of its body weight every single day just to maintain its metabolism. A colony of otters could clear an urchin bed in months. The backlash was fierce and immediate. Shellfish harvesters watched their stocks plummet in the release zones. Divers reported showing up to beds they had worked for years only to find them stripped clean. Industry associations argued the government had prioritized an ecological experiment over the livelihoods of people who fed their families from these waters. Tensions spiked. In some coastal communities, there were quiet discussions about taking matters into their own hands, though no confirmed acts of sabotage were ever documented. To make matters worse, the otters themselves weren't cooperating. Of the 89 animals released, many scattered far from the target zone. Others succumbed to the stress of relocation. Within the first year, the population had dropped significantly. For several years, surveys showed discouraging numbers. The urchin barrens remained intact. The kelp did not return. By 1975, even Dr. McCaskey had doubts. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The animals are not establishing as we hoped. I fear we may have underestimated the scale of what we're asking nature to do." The experiment, it seemed, had failed. The ocean remained silent. But ecosystems don't operate on human timelines, and the otters, quietly, had been doing their work. By the late 1970s, something had shifted in Cheklisset Bay. In the pockets where the surviving otters had established territories, the purple carpet was beginning to thin. Researchers diving in those zones reported seeing something they hadn't witnessed in decades: bare rock. The urchins were being hunted. And in the clearings the otters left behind, dormant spores that had been waiting in the sediment finally caught the sunlight. Bull kelp, one of the fastest-growing organisms on the planet, can grow up to 10 centimeters per day under ideal conditions. Once the grazing pressure was removed, the forest didn't just return. It surged toward the surface. The transformation became undeniable. Scientists have a term for what happened next: trophic cascade. A chain reaction that starts at the top of the food chain and reverberates all the way down to the foundation. The otters ate the urchins. The urchins stopped eating the kelp. The kelp grew back, and everything else followed. With the forest restored, the waves slowed before they hit the shore. Sediment settled. Water clarity improved. Herring laid their eggs on the kelp fronds. Juvenile salmon used the dappled shadows to hide from predators. Lingcod and rockfish returned to hunt the smaller fish. Seabirds, murres, cormorants, and eagles came back to feed on the abundance below. In less than 2 decades, a dead zone had been transformed into one of the most productive marine ecosystems on the Pacific coast. The otters hadn't just returned, they had unlocked an entire food web. Today, the results of Dr. McCaskey's gamble are measurable, not just in biodiversity, but in hard economics. A comprehensive 2020 study from the University of British Columbia attempted to quantify the trade-off. The researchers acknowledged the cost. The shellfish industry lost an estimated $7 million annually due to otter predation. The anger from harvesters was real, and it was justified. But the gains dwarfed the losses. $53 million in annual ecosystem benefits. The restored kelp forests sequestered vast amounts of carbon dioxide, a service increasingly valuable in the age of climate change. Finfish stocks rebounded, boosting the commercial fishing industry. Recreational fishing brought revenue to coastal towns, and a new economy emerged entirely: ecotourism. Thousands of visitors now travel to the British Columbia coast every year specifically to see the otters. Kayak tours, whale-watching boats, and wildlife photographers have turned the otter into an economic engine more valuable than the shellfish industry it disrupted. The communities that once opposed the reintroduction now host otter festivals. The animal that was called a threat became a mascot. The story of the sea otter is a rare victory in a century marked by ecological loss. It taught us that nature is resilient, but it is also a machine of interdependent parts. Remove one gear, and the entire system can grind to a halt. From the edge of extinction to the guardians of the coast, the sea otter has reclaimed its place in these waters. But the story isn't over. As climate change warms the Pacific, new pressures are emerging. Marine heat waves stress the kelp. Shifting currents alter food availability. The stability of this hard-won recovery will be tested in the coming decades. Scientists are watching closely. For now, however, the silence is gone. The forest has returned, and the architects of the reef are back at work. Should we prioritize restoring ecosystems, even when it hurts industries that depend on them? There's no easy answer. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this story surprised you, you might like this video on another ecosystem that came back from the brink. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.